Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I used to think the word underground sounded calm. It sounded like scheduled work, clipped radio calls, orange cones, and a checklist you could finish before lunch. It sounded like the world above could do whatever it wanted while you stayed in your lane, headlamp on, gloves tight, counting cable ties and reading panel labels with a finger because the letters were worn off. Now, underground meant something else. It meant being alive because you were hidden. It meant listening to a city die through concrete. My name is Evan Rourke. I was a field technician for a telecommunications contractor in Philadelphia. Mostly fiber, sometimes copper, sometimes whatever the city decided was urgent enough to pay overtime for. On paper, I supported critical infrastructure. In real life, I crawled through places nobody wanted to picture, so that people could stream movies, make calls, and pretend the world was stable. The tunnel I took shelter in was never meant for people. It was meant for pipes, cables, and heat. A utility corridor, what older guys still called a steam tunnel, running under part of University City, branching like roots between basements and service vaults. It carried insulated steam lines, chilled water in some sections, power in armored conduit, and cable trays full of communications lines. It had access points that looked like ordinary doors in maintenance rooms, and hatches that opened into sidewalk vaults you'd never notice unless you were paid to notice them. It was a place you worked in, not lived in. I didn't choose it because it was smart. I chose it because it was there, and because I ran out of choices above ground. That morning started like any other job that was going to become a story people wouldn't believe. We had a work order to inspect a fiber splice case that had been throwing alarms, light loss, intermittent drops, feeding a small cluster of buildings near the hospitals. The plan was simple. Access the tunnel through a service door in a basement mechanical room, walk a few hundred yards, verify the splice enclosure wasn't taking on water, check the cable route for crush points, and get out. My partner was Luis Moreno, a calm, competent guy with a shaved head and a soft voice who always kept his tools laid out like he was doing surgery. He'd been a Navy electrician years ago, and he treated every panel like it could hurt you if you got sloppy. We were both in our early 30s, both tired, both used to the way the city chewed up plans. We signed in with building security, clipped on our badge tags, and went down. The basement smelled like hot metal, disinfectant, and wet concrete. The mechanical room was loud with pumps and fans. A big silver duct line rumbled overhead, and there was a constant hiss from a steam trap somewhere behind the insulation. A wall-mounted sign screamed in bright colors about confined space entry. Another sign listed emergency numbers, most of which assumed an emergency would still have someone on the other end of the phone. We did it by the book because the book was written in blood and lawsuits. Gas monitor on. Oxygen level good. No dangerous gases. Ventilation normal. Radios checked. Headlamps on helmets. Gloves. Eye protection. A quick look at the printed tunnel map folded in a plastic sleeve, showing the corridor like a simple line with a few branches and labeled access points. It wasn't a complete map. It never was. Utility tunnels get changed, extended, sealed, rerouted, and forgotten. The map was good enough to get you back to the door you came in, which was all anyone needed in a world that still ran on calendars. Luis pulled the heavy service door open. It was thick steel, painted institutional beige, with a handle that always resisted like it was offended you wanted in. Beyond it was a short stairwell down, then a second door, then the tunnel. The air changed immediately. It went from dry mechanical room to damp, warm, and slightly metallic. You could taste the insulation and old dust even through a decent mask. The tunnel walls were concrete, stained and patched. The ceiling was low enough that you had to mind your helmet. The floor was flat but slick in places, and the whole space was lined with infrastructure. Steam pipes thick as tree trunks, smaller return lines, conduit banks, cable trays, junction boxes, valves with hand wheels, and the occasional dripping spot that had been dripping long enough to make a small stalagmite of mineral deposits. We started walking, boots scuffing, headlamps bouncing off the glossy wrapped insulation. Luis was talking about his kid's school project, something with a model bridge, when the first odd thing happened. Our radios crackled, and then went silent in a way that wasn't normal interference. A second later, the tunnel lights, long fluorescent fixtures bolted to the wall, flickered. I stopped and looked back. "You see that?" "Voltage sag," Luis said immediately, like it was a reflex. "Could be a transient. Could be a feeder issue." A transient, a feeder issue. Words you used when the world made sense. He checked his handheld meter out of habit, then shook his head like it was silly. "If the power's unstable, we do what we came to do and get out." We kept going. A few minutes later, we reached the splice area. A cluster of cable trays that dipped down into a wall niche where an enclosure was mounted. The enclosure was the size of a small suitcase, black plastic with latches, and a tag number that matched our work order. There was moisture on the wall nearby, but the case itself looked intact. Luis knelt, steady, and started his inspection. I held light, checked the cable jacket for abrasions, looked for signs of rodents. Everything seemed annoyingly normal, which was how bad days start, with the universe acting like it has nothing to do with you. Then we heard the noise from above. It came through the tunnel like a vibration more than a sound at first, like heavy feet on a ceiling. Then it sharpened into shouting. Then something that wasn't quite shouting, more like a panicked chorus in a hallway. The tunnel carried it strangely, turning words into echoes. I couldn't make out what was being said, but I could hear fear. Luis froze with his hand on a latch. "That's not maintenance." I moved to the nearest access ladder, an iron rung set into the wall leading to a small hatch that would open into a service vault near a sidewalk. I'd used it once before to check a conduit run. I put my hand on the rung and felt the vibration again, stronger, and then a single, sharp bang echoed down the tunnel. A gunshot. I pulled my hand back like the metal was hot. Luis stood, fast and controlled, and snapped the enclosure shut without finishing. "We're leaving. Now." We turned back the way we came, and that's when the tunnel lights flickered again, and then went out completely. Our headlamps became the only light, narrow cones cutting through humidity. In the sudden dark, the tunnel felt smaller, like the concrete walls moved in. Luis keyed the radio. "Building security, this is contractor team in the utility corridor. Do you copy?" Only static. I tried mine. Same thing. Dead noise. We kept moving, and the sounds above changed. The shouting turned into screaming, then into something worse. A ragged, hungry noise that didn't sound like a person trying to communicate. It sounded like a person trying to reach something. We passed a branch corridor that led toward another building. A painted arrow pointed to an access room. We didn't take it. We kept to the main line because we knew it. Then we saw light ahead. Not the warm glow of tunnel fixtures. Daylight, pale and wrong, spilling down the stairwell at our entry door. The door at the top, between the basement mechanical room and the tunnel stair, was cracked open. That door should have been closed. It was supposed to self-close. Luis slowed, and I could tell he was listening hard, measuring the risk the way he measured voltage. He whispered, "We go quiet." We climbed the stairs without talking, boots careful, hands on rail. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my teeth. At the top, I leaned forward and looked in through the crack. The mechanical room beyond was still loud with fans, but the sound had a ragged edge to it, like systems were hunting for stable operation. The fluorescent lights above were on, but one was flickering, and there was a security guard on the floor. He wasn't moving. The guard's radio was on the ground near his hand, hissing feedback. His badge lanyard was twisted around his neck. His face was turned away, and I couldn't tell what happened to him without stepping into the room, which my body refused to do. Luis looked over my shoulder and sucked in a careful breath. He didn't curse, he didn't panic. He just reached slowly and eased the door open a little more so we could see. There were dark smears on the floor near the guard, and a trail leading toward the main corridor outside the mechanical room. The smear wasn't a detail I wanted to analyze. I just knew something had dragged or stumbled through. A scream cut off somewhere above, muffled by concrete and distance, then a series of heavy impacts like someone slamming into a door. Luis's hand went to my chest and pushed me back without looking at me. No. He shut the door gently, like we were closing a sleeping child's bedroom. Then he turned and looked down the stairs into the tunnel dark. "Back in," he said. "We're not going up." It's hard to explain what it feels like to accept that the normal world has stopped being safe. There's a moment where your brain tries to bargain. You think about calling someone, about getting to your car, about going home. Your brain throws images at you like a slot machine. Your apartment, your fridge, your bed, the street, with normal traffic. Then reality is the smear on the floor, and the scream that doesn't sound like an argument anymore. We went back down into the tunnel, and the door shut behind us, and the sound of the mechanical room became a muffled roar through steel. Luis clicked off his headlamp for a second and then back on, like he was testing darkness. "We need a plan." I tried to keep my voice steady. "We can go to the next access. There's a maintenance closet near the hospital loading dock." "And if it's the same up there?" "Then we keep going." He nodded slowly. "We keep going." We walked deeper, away from the entry, away from the daylight. It felt backward in every instinct, but the tunnel was the only place that didn't currently contain screaming. As we moved, we started to seeing signs that the tunnel's systems weren't stable. The ventilation fans that normally kept air moving were quieter. Condensation beaded on pipes more heavily. A sump pump pit we passed had water higher than it should have been, close to the lip. Luis stopped at a wall panel and opened it with his screwdriver. Inside were breakers and labeled circuits. He frowned. "Power's on some feeds, off on others. That's not normal." He shut it again. "If the grid is unstable, these tunnels can become a trap." I looked down the corridor into darkness that swallowed our headlamp beams. "So we can't stay forever." "No," he said, "but we can survive today." That first day underground was a lesson in how quickly you run out of assumptions. We found an access room about half a mile down, marked by a painted sign, "Maintenance Alcove." It was a small concrete chamber off the main corridor with a metal bench, a cabinet with spare fuses and pipe insulation, and a door that led up to another building basement. The door was closed. Luis listened, ear close to the metal. I did the same. At first I heard nothing, then, faintly, something scraped above, like a chair moving, or shoes on tile. Luis mouthed, "People. Could be survivors, could be infected, could be both, depending on how fast a bad day spreads." He reached for the handle and stopped. He looked at me, and I could see the calculation. If we opened that door and it was wrong, we couldn't outrun anything in a narrow stairwell. We backed away and Luis took out a small inspection camera, a flexible scope we used for looking into conduit runs. He fed it through a gap at the bottom of the door where the seal had worn. The camera cable slid under with a soft rasp. The tiny screen showed a sliver of the world above. A dim storage room lit by emergency lights. A mop bucket, shelving, a dropped clipboard. No visible people. Then the camera image jerked. Something had touched it from the other side, tugging the cable. Luis pulled back fast, and the camera scraped back under the door like a worm retreating. We stepped back, both of us holding our breath. A second later, there was a slow, deliberate scratch on the door, metal on metal, as if someone above was dragging a fingernail along it. Luis whispered, barely audible, "No." We didn't run. We just turned and walked away quickly, because running in a tunnel makes noise, and noise is how you invite attention from places you can't see. We kept going. By the time our watches said late afternoon, the world above sounded different. The screaming had become sporadic. Sirens came and went, then came less. Helicopters thudded overhead once, twice, then not at all. The city didn't go quiet exactly, but it lost its organized rhythm. It sounded like a building losing power floor by floor. We found a section of tunnel where the steam lines were insulated but still warm enough to make the air uncomfortable. Luis said heat meant the central plant was still running. That was good and bad. Good because power still existed somewhere. Bad because if the plant failed suddenly, steam pressure could change fast, and valves could blow, and the tunnel could fill with heat you couldn't fight. We eventually reached a larger junction room where several corridors met. This wasn't a simple corridor anymore. It was a hub with wall charts, pipe labels, and a floor drain that led to a sump pit the size of a small swimming pool. A ladder went up to a hatch in the ceiling. There were also 2 heavy doors leading to other service corridors. And there, in the corner, we found something that made my stomach tighten. A backpack. Not ours. A cheap school-style backpack, gray, lying beside the wall like someone set it down and forgot. Next to it was a half-full plastic water bottle. Luis crouched and checked the bottle. Still cool, recent. "Someone else is down here," I said. Or was. We called out, not shouting, but loud enough to travel. "Hello? Anyone down here?" Our voices echoed. A long moment passed. Then, faintly, a reply came back from one of the side corridors. A woman's voice, hoarse and careful. "Don't come closer, just talk." Luis raised his hands even though she couldn't see him yet. "We're maintenance contractors. We got trapped down here. We're not looking for trouble." Another pause. Then she stepped into view, headlamp on, holding something in both hands. It wasn't a gun. It was a heavy flashlight held like a club. She was in her 20s, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled into a messy knot. She wore scrubs under a jacket, and her shoes were hospital clogs that made no sense down here. Her face was sweaty and streaked with grime, and her eyes looked too focused, like she'd been awake for days. "I'm Nadia," she said. "I came down here because the loading dock was gone. The whole place. It wasn't people anymore." Luis nodded slowly. "Luis, this is Evan." I swallowed. "You're from the hospital?" She didn't answer directly, which told me enough. People who work in hospitals have a way of not spilling details when details can break you. Nadia glanced at the backpack in the corner. "That's mine. I left it when I heard you. I didn't want you to see me first and decide I was a threat." "Smart," Luis said. Nadia looked past us, down the main corridor. "Is it worse out there?" Luis didn't lie. "We tried our entry. There was a guard down. We heard gunshots. We heard things." Nadia's jaw clenched. "It's everywhere." We stood in that junction room, 3 people who hadn't planned to share air and tried to build a plan with nothing but tunnel maps and fear. Nadia had come down through a basement access near a hospital service corridor. When the outbreak hit, the loading dock became a choke point. People tried to get inside, people tried to get out, and then the infected started appearing like a bad magic trick. She'd heard staff shouting about locking doors, about a patient biting someone, about security trying to hold a stairwell. She said the phrase, biting, like it was a technical term which made it worse. She had escaped by following a maintenance worker through a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. The maintenance worker didn't make it down the stairs. Nadia had slammed the door and kept going. "Confined space training?" Louise asked her. Nadia gave a short, humorless laugh. "I watched a video once. Does that count?" Louise looked at me, and I could see his frustration. This was a place where mistakes killed you quietly, but he didn't say it. He just took out his own water bottle and offered it to Nadia. She took a careful sip, then handed it back. "Thank you." We pooled what we had: 2 headlamps, spare batteries, a multi-tool, a small first aid kit that was mostly bandages and antiseptic, a couple protein bars crushed in my bag, Nadia's backpack with 2 more water bottles, a phone that was down to 20% and had no signal, a pen, a notepad, and a cheap phone charger that might as well have been a paperclip. Luis also had a compact emergency radio in his truck, but his truck was above ground, and above ground was a different planet now. "What's your plan?" Nadia asked. Luis looked around the junction room. "First, we don't die of something stupid down here. Air, water, light. Second, we find an exit that isn't full of infected." "And if there isn't one?" I asked before I could stop myself. Luis's eyes flicked to me. "Then we make time." Nadia hugged her flashlight closer. "There are other people in the tunnels?" "Maybe," I said. "We found your bag, and we heard movement above 1 access." Nadia's voice got tight. "Movement like survivors?" I thought of the slow scratch on the door. Unclear. We decided to move deeper to a place where we could shelter for the night. The junction room was too exposed, too many corridors, too many places for something to come from. Luis remembered a maintenance bay farther down that had a small equipment closet, and, more importantly, a door that could be locked from the inside. Not a perfect door, nothing underground ever is, but a barrier. We walked in a tight group, headlamps angled low to avoid blinding each other. The tunnel's humidity made everything feel close. Steam lines hissed softly at joints. Somewhere, water dripped in a steady rhythm that started sounding like a clock you couldn't shut off. At the maintenance bay, we found the door and the closet. The closet held spare insulation, some orange cones, and a box of disposable dust masks. It also held a hand-crank flashlight in plastic packaging, the kind you see at hardware stores near hurricanes. It felt like a gift from a universe that still had inventory. Luis tested the door. It had a metal latch and a lock that used a simple key. No key, but the latch could be secured with a piece of metal and some force. Luis used a thick wrench from a wall rack, tools left by tunnel crews, and jammed it through the latch loop, then tied it off with electrical tape from my pouch until it couldn't easily be pulled free. "It's not a safe," he said, "but it's something." We sat on the concrete floor with our backs against the wall and ate half a protein bar each like it was a holiday meal. Nadia tried to stay composed, but her hands shook when she tore open a wrapper. I took inventory again. Like listing objects could control reality. 2.5 water bottles left, some snacks, a first aid kit, 3 phones with low batteries and no signal, no blankets, no real bedding, no way to cook, no toilet. Underground survival doesn't give you dramatic choices first, it gives you humiliating ones. We used an empty plastic bottle for a bathroom solution and kept it sealed in a corner, because the tunnel's air was already heavy and we weren't going to make it worse. Nadia looked away when I did it, cheeks red. and I hated that this was what the end of the world did to dignity. We tried sleeping in shifts. Luis insisted. He took first watch, sitting upright with his headlamp off, listening. I lay on my side with my jacket under my head and watched the way condensation formed on the pipes and fell like slow rain. My mind kept playing the moment at the door, the guard on the floor, the gunshot. Every time I started to drift, a distant clang echoed through the tunnel and my eyes snapped open. At some point, I fell asleep anyway because the body always chooses survival over fear when it runs out of fuel. When I woke, it was hard to tell time. Underground has its own clock, measured in battery life and hunger. Luis said it was around 6 in the morning based on his watch. Nadia looked like she hadn't slept at all. The first thing we noticed was the air. It felt thicker, warmer. The ventilation was weaker. The tunnel smelled more metallic, and there was a faint odor like overheating plastic. Luis frowned and checked his gas monitor again. It still read acceptable oxygen, but he didn't look satisfied. Fans might be down. "What happens if they stop?" Nadia asked. Luis didn't sugarcoat it. "Stale air, heat buildup in some sections. If there's any leak or combustion above that pulls fumes down here, we will have the airflow to clear it. Also, humidity climbs and everything gets harder." "And the pumps?" I asked, thinking of the sump pit. Luis looked at me. "If sump pumps fail and water rises, these corridors can flood, not like a movie torrent. Slow, steady, unstoppable." The thought of water filling the tunnel made my chest tighten. Not because I couldn't swim, but because you can't swim in a narrow corridor full of cables and pipes and obstacles. You drown in a place that was never meant to hold water. We had to move. Luis's idea was to reach a known egress point on the edge of the service network, an access near a utility plant building that might still have staff, generators, and a way to get news. He called it the Central Plant in plain language, a facility that produced steam and chilled water for a cluster of buildings. If it was still running, it might still have people. If it had shut down, it might still have emergency power. Either way, it was a destination. Nadia didn't love the idea of seeking people. She'd seen enough of what people did when they panicked, but she also understood that staying in a shrinking air pocket with failing pumps wasn't a plan. We packed what we had and started walking. By mid-morning, we reached a section of tunnel where the heat increased sharply. The air shimmered faintly in our headlamp beams. The steam lines here were closer, and the insulation was worn in spots, making the tunnel feel like a long, low sauna. I started sweating hard. Nadia's face went pale, and she slowed. Luis made us stop and drink small sips, rationed. He put Nadia between us so she wouldn't lag behind. "This is what people forget," he said quietly. "Underground isn't cold, not always. It can cook you." We passed another sump pit. The water level was higher than yesterday. Not inches higher, enough that it was obvious. Luis cursed under his breath, then caught himself and replaced it with a sharp exhale. Pumps are not keeping up. We kept moving faster. At one point, we heard voices ahead, not echoes from above. Voices in the tunnel. Two men, talking low, arguing about direction. Luis raised his hand, and we stopped. Nadia's grip tightened on her flashlight. We called out first, careful, like we'd done before. "Hello?" The voices stopped instantly. Then one of them replied, "Stay where you are." Two headlamps appeared around a bend. Two men in work clothes, both dirty, both armed with improvised weapons. A metal pipe in one man's hands, a heavy wrench in the other. No guns. Just tools turned into last resort comfort objects. They looked us over the way people do when they're deciding whether you're a lifeboat or a leak. "I'm Dean," the taller one said. He had a hard face and a scraped cheek. "This is Malik." Malik's eyes flicked to Nadia's scrubs. Hospital? Nadia nodded once. Yes. Dean's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. We're from a maintenance crew. We came down last night when the street went crazy. The access we used got blocked. Luis introduced us and explained our situation in as few words as possible. Dean listened, then nodded toward the direction they'd come from. We tried 2 exits. One had banging on the door. The other had noise, not people noise. Malik added, We heard splashing farther down, like water moving where it shouldn't. Luis asked, You have a map? Dean pulled out a folded sheet, more detailed than ours, with handwritten notes. Not official. We marked it ourselves over the years. Luis's eyes lit up with the first hint of relief I'd seen since yesterday. Maps were power underground. We formed a larger group, 5 people now, and decided to move together. More people meant more noise and more needs, but it also meant more eyes, more hands, more options. Dean wanted to head toward a subway maintenance connection he believed existed, hoping it would lead to an exit farther from the hospital chaos. Luis didn't trust that route without confirmation. Utility corridors and transit infrastructure don't always connect the way rumors say they do, and getting lost underground is how you die without drama. Malik, who spoke less, pointed at the map. Here. This shows a service stair up into a campus building that has a generator room. If any place has power, it's there. Luis traced the line with his finger. That's near the plant I'm thinking of, same direction. Dean didn't love agreeing, but he agreed. We moved. As the day went on, the tunnel became more hostile. The lights didn't come back. Ventilation stayed weak. The air felt like it had weight. The water levels in pits were visibly rising, and the sounds above, when we passed near access points, were no longer just panic. They were the dull thuds of impact, like bodies hitting doors, like something relentless moving through hallways. We avoided every door. Around early afternoon, we hit our first real underground failure. A section where water had seeped across the floor in a shallow sheet, flowing from a side corridor. It wasn't deep yet, but it moved steadily, carrying dust and grit. It made the floor slick. It also meant something upstream had already flooded and was spilling into the main line. Dean stared at it. It's starting. Luis nodded grimly. We have to stay ahead of it. We crossed carefully, using pipes as handholds. Nadia nearly slipped, and Malik caught her by the elbow. She whispered a shaky thank you. A half-hour later, we reached a door marked Electrical Service. Luis stopped, listening. Silence. He tried the handle. Locked. Dean put his shoulder to it, then stopped when Luis shot him a look. If we make noise, we invite things. Dean spread his hands. Then what? Luis pulled out his multi-tool, inspected the lock plate and shook his head, not picking this without time and tools. We moved on, frustration building. Underground, every locked door feels personal. Then Malik pointed to a side ladder that went up into a small overhead hatch. That hatch should open into a mechanical chase. Those are often unsecured. Should, Dean muttered, but he moved toward it anyway. Luis climbed first, steady. He pushed the hatch. It shifted, resisted, then opened with a small groan. Air came down from above, cooler, with a faint smell of dust and old paint. Not fresh outdoor air, but indoor air from a building that still had volume. That was good. Luis climbed through and disappeared. We waited, tense, listening for any sign he'd run into something awful. A moment later, his voice came down, hushed but relieved. Clear. It's a service chase. Tight but clear. We can move up and into a maintenance room. We climbed one by one. Nadia struggled with the ladder because of her shoes, and I silently promised myself that if we got out of this, I'd never take boots for granted again. Malik went last, guarding below until we were all up. The space above was narrow, like a vertical corridor between walls, lined with conduit and pipes. It was the kind of place you opened once every few years for inspection, not the kind of place you took shelter in. Luis found a panel door and eased it open. We stepped into a small maintenance room with concrete walls, a floor drain, and a humming sound that made my heart jump. A generator. Not a big outdoor unit. A building-level standby generator system, likely diesel, housed in a ventilated enclosure. It was running, and the vibration traveled through the floor like a heartbeat. The room also had emergency lighting, dim, yellow, but it was light that didn't depend on our headlamps. Dean exhaled so hard it sounded like a laugh. Power. We've got power. Luis didn't celebrate yet. He looked at the control panel, reading indicators. It's on load, that means the main power is out, and the generator is carrying critical circuits. Nadia looked around. Does that mean there are people here? Maybe, Luis said. But it also means this building is worth defending. People defend what they can power. We listened at the door leading out of the maintenance room. The corridor beyond was quiet, but quiet indoors can mean empty or it can mean waiting. Luis cracked the door and peered out. The hallway was lit by emergency lights. A sign on the wall indicated we were in a service level of a campus building, part of a medical research facility based on the directory. The air was cooler, the ceiling was higher, the space felt human compared to the tunnel. We stepped out carefully, moving like we were in someone else's house. We found a stairwell. The door was closed. Luis tested it, unlocked. He opened it a few inches and looked out through the narrow gap into the stairwell. Empty. We climbed up one level and reached another door that led into a ground-level corridor. Luis didn't open it. He just pressed his ear to it. Nothing. Dean shifted impatiently. We can't live in the tunnel. We can't live in stairwells either. Nadia's voice was tight. Above ground is where it started. Malik, who had been quiet most of the day, spoke firmly. We need information. We need water. This building might have both. Luis nodded. Agreed. But we don't walk into open spaces. We clear and control, slow. Dean scoffed, but he didn't argue. In the last 24 hours, slow had kept us alive. We pushed into the corridor. The building was not abandoned, not completely. We found signs of people fast, a toppled chair, a backpack, a water cooler bottle missing, a door barricaded with a table, but we didn't see anyone, which was worse in a different way. Then we heard a cough. It came from behind the barricaded door. Luis raised his hand and spoke calmly. Hey, we're not infected. We're coming from the service tunnels. We need water and a safe place. Is anyone in there? A woman's voice answered, shaky but firm. Don't come closer. If you force the door, I'll scream. Luis didn't move. Okay, we're staying here. My name is Luis. We have 5 people, one is a nurse. Nadia stepped forward a little. I'm Nadia. I work at the hospital. We're just trying to survive. Silence for a long moment. Then the voice said, Slide your hands under the gap, palms up. We did. It felt ridiculous and humiliating, but it was also smart. It showed we weren't holding weapons at the ready. The barricade shifted slightly, and we saw an eye through a crack. Then another face, a man this time, older, with a beard and a look that said he'd been awake since the first scream. The door opened just enough for them to see us fully. Inside was a small office suite. Break room, storage, 2 offices, packed with 4 people. 2 men, 2 women. They had bottled water, a few boxes of snacks, a first aid kit, and a couple blankets. They also had a fire extinguisher held like a weapon. The woman who spoke first introduced herself as Sharon. She said she was facilities administration. The bearded man was Ken, a lab supervisor. The others were a graduate student named Priya and a security guard named Tarek, who looked like he'd been through something he didn't want to describe. They let us in after a tense exchange, because they understood what we understood. 5 people in a hallway could become a problem, but 5 people outside also became a responsibility. The apocalypse forces community the way gravity forces falling. We talked in low voices while we ate and drank tiny portions like it was rationing season. Sharon said the building had gone into lockdown when the first reports hit the news. At first, it sounded like a riot. Then it sounded like something else. Security tried to hold the main doors. People flooded stairwells. Then someone got bitten in the lobby, and the lobby became a disaster. Ken said, "We saw it through the glass. It wasn't a fight. It was like they didn't care about being hurt. They just wanted contact." Priya had a phone with a few % battery and a recorded video clip she'd taken from a window before the power went. It showed the street outside, abandoned cars, a crowd moving wrong, like a swarm with no pattern. The clip ended when Priya started crying and dropped the phone. There was no official information, no emergency broadcast we could access. Cellular networks were overloaded and collapsing. Social media, when it worked, was pure chaos. Contradictory reports, rumors, people pleading for help, videos that made your stomach turn even without showing anything graphic. Tarek, the security guard, said something that stuck. It doesn't matter what it is, it matters what it does. And what it does is spread fast. Luis asked about water. Sharon said they had building water, but she didn't trust it long term. If the city loses pressure, contamination happens. Also, if the generator runs out of fuel, the pumps that keep systems stable might fail. Luis nodded like he'd been thinking the same thing underground. Fuel becomes a clock. We stayed in that office suite for one night. It was the first night with walls that didn't sweat steam. It was the first night where we could sit in a chair. It was also the first night where the fear shifted from immediate, something behind a door, to strategic. What happens when the generator stops, when the water stops, when the building becomes a beacon in a dark city? In the middle of the night, we heard the first impact on the building's main doors. It was distant, but the sound traveled through ventilation shafts like a warning drum. A heavy thud, then another, then a scraping, like hands on glass. Everyone froze. Tarek stood and raised the fire extinguisher. They found it. Sharon whispered, "How?" "We blocked the lobby." Ken's face was pale. Noise, light, smell, I don't know. The impacts continued, slow and relentless, not like a person banging in anger, but like something testing a barrier it didn't understand, except that it wanted what was inside. Luis leaned toward me and spoke low. "We can't stay if they're at the doors. The longer they press, the more likely something gives, or more arrive." Dean, who had been quiet, said, "Back to the tunnel." Nadia's eyes widened. "No." Dean's voice hardened. "You have a better idea?" Luis held up a hand. "We don't panic, we plan. We have options." He asked Sharon about the building's lower levels. Sharon admitted there were service corridors, maintenance shafts, and, crucially, another access to the utility tunnel network. Luis nodded slowly. "Then, our best move might be to leave before this place becomes a trap. We take water and supplies and go back underground, but we don't go to the same corridor we came from. We use the tunnels to relocate farther out, to an exit that puts distance between us and the dense downtown." Ken looked at him like he was crazy. "You want to go back into that?" Luis's answer was calm. Underground is dangerous. Above ground is worse right now. The tunnels are how we move without being seen. It wasn't a comforting plan. It was just the only one that had logic. At dawn, if you can call it dawn when you're inside a building with emergency lights, we prepared to move. Sharon gave us a box of bottled water and as much packaged food as she could spare without starving her own group. Tarek insisted on coming with us because he didn't want to stay in a building being tested by a growing crowd. Priya, shaking, chose to stay with Ken because the thought of tunnels made her panic. We split, and it felt like tearing cloth. Nobody wanted to be the one to leave someone behind, but survival isn't one big heroic decision. It's 100 small ones that feel wrong until you live long enough to regret not making them. Our group now was 6: me, Luis, Nadia, Dean, Malik, and Tarek. We moved through service corridors guided by Sharon's directions, down a stairwell that smelled like dust, through a mechanical room with humming equipment and to a locked door marked Utility Access. Sharon had the key. She handed it to Luis and said quietly, "If you make it, if you find a safe way out, remember, there are people still here." Luis nodded, eyes serious. "We'll try." He unlocked the door and pulled it open. The smell hit us immediately. Damp heat, metal, old insulation, the tunnel's breath. We climbed down and closed the door behind us. The city's noise became a muffled pressure again. It was like returning to a bunker while a storm rolled overhead. We walked fast because we all understood something now. Every place becomes a trap. Eventually, if systems fail. Buildings fail, doors fail, people fail, tunnels fail, nothing lasts. You just choose what fails last. As we moved, the tunnel felt worse than before. Water was higher in the pits. In one section, the floor had an inch of standing water. In another, it was 2 inches, creeping. Luis checked his monitor more often. Oxygen is okay, but humidity is climbing. Fans are definitely down in some sections. We passed a junction where a side corridor had fully flooded. The water was black, still, filling the corridor like a sealed mouth. Dean stared into it and shook his head. "That's death." Malik pointed at the map Dean carried. "We need higher routes, avoid low points." Dean grunted. "Tell me something I don't know." Then we heard something that made all of us stop. A splash. Not our splash. Ahead, around a bend, something moved through water, slow and dragging. Luis killed his headlamp instantly, and the tunnel went dark except for faint spill from others before they followed his lead. One by one, lights went off until we were in near blackness. We stood with our backs against the wall, breath held. The splash came again, closer, accompanied by a low, wet shuffle. Nadia's hand found my sleeve and gripped hard enough to hurt. Tarek held his fire extinguisher like it was suddenly a lifeline. Dean's metal pipe was angled forward, and I could feel the tension in him like a wire pulled tight. Then, in the darkness, we heard a sound that wasn't water. A faint, broken vocalization, like someone trying to speak but only remembering the shape of sound. Luis leaned toward us and whispered so softly it barely traveled. No light, no noise. The shuffling passed the bend, and for a second, in the thin glow of a distant emergency fixture far down the corridor, I saw a silhouette. It was human-shaped, but the posture was wrong. The head tilted oddly, shoulders hunched, arms hanging. It moved with a lurching rhythm, not purposeful, but persistent. It didn't look at us. It didn't know we were there. It just moved down the corridor through shallow water, leaving ripples. Another silhouette followed it. Then another, 3 of them, moving like they were pulled by a thread we couldn't see. They passed and faded into darkness. We waited long after the last ripple settled. Nobody spoke. Our bodies stayed locked in the same stiff posture, like speaking would break a spell. When Luis finally turned his headlamp back on, the light looked too bright, too honest. Dean swallowed. That was them. Nadia's voice was barely there. How did they get down here? Luis looked at the ceiling, at the pipes, at the access hatches. Same way we did. Doors, stairs. People leave them open in a panic, or they force them, or maintenance fails and seals break. Underground isn't sealed from the world, it's connected to it. Tarek muttered, so nowhere is safe. Luis's answer was blunt. Somewhere is safer for longer. That's what we chase. We moved on. That was when the real tunnel story began. Not the first panic, not the first shelter, but the long endurance of moving underground while the city above became something unrecognizable. We walked for hours, following Dean's map and Luis's memory, choosing routes that stayed higher when possible. We avoided known low points, sump pits, drain valleys, sections near stormwater interfaces. We listened constantly at access doors. Sometimes we heard nothing. Sometimes we heard distant banging. Once we heard a muffled cry that made Nadia stop dead until Luis pulled her gently forward. We learned to communicate with hand signals because whispering carried. We learned to step where the floor was rougher to avoid slipping. We learned to ration batteries as carefully as water, because darkness is manageable. Dead headlamps are panic. We also learned that tunnels have moods. In some stretches, the air was hotter, heavy with steam heat. In others, it was cooler, near chilled water lines and concrete closer to groundwater. In some stretches, the tunnel smelled like mold. In others, it smelled like hot dust. In one stretch, it smelled like fuel, and Luis made us hurry, fear in his eyes, because fuel smell underground means a risk you don't negotiate with. We reached a maintenance room in late afternoon, if watches meant anything, where a wall-mounted sink still had water. Cold water, weak pressure, but water. We drank like people who had been pretending to be civilized. Luis warned us not to gulp, not to waste. Dean ignored him and drank deeply anyway, then regretted it when his stomach cramped. It wasn't just dehydration. It was stress eating his insides. Tarek found a cabinet with the disposable gloves and a box of face masks. We took them. Underground dust is a slow killer, and we didn't need another problem. Nadia surprised me by being useful in ways I didn't expect. She wasn't a tunnel person, but she was calm in crisis. She checked blisters, cleaned small cuts, reminded us to drink even when we didn't feel thirsty, and forced Dean to slow down when his anger made him reckless. At one point, Dean snapped at her. "Stop treating us like patients." Nadia's eyes flashed. "Then stop acting like you're invincible." He shut up after that. We slept that night in a slightly raised service alcove where the floor was dry. We took turns watching again. The difference now was that watching meant listening for splashes, shuffles, and the faint metallic scrape of something moving with no reason. I took a watch around 3 a.m. The tunnel was silent except for distant drips. My headlamp was off to save battery. I sat in darkness and tried to picture my apartment in South Philly, my kitchen table, the way the street looked when kids rode bikes and neighbors argued about parking. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else. In the dark, I realized something that made my throat tighten. I didn't know if the outbreak was just Philadelphia. I didn't know if it was the whole country. I didn't know if anyone was coming. That uncertainty is a weight you can't set down. At some point, I heard a faint sound, far down the corridor. A thud, then another, like something bumping into concrete. Then a long pause. Then another thud. I held my breath and listened. It didn't come closer. It just existed, somewhere in the network, like an animal in a cave. My watch ended. I woke Luis and whispered, "There's something moving out there." Luis didn't look surprised. He just nodded, like a man hearing rain on a roof. I know. The next day, we hit the point where the tunnel tried to decide whether we would live. We reached a section on the map marked as a crossing under a road and near a utility vault that, according to Dean, had an exit into a less dense neighborhood. Not open countryside. Philadelphia doesn't turn into empty fields quickly, but less dense, fewer high-rises, more chance to move without being hemmed in by buildings. The problem was the crossing was lower than the corridors around it. A shallow dip. Not a sump pit, but enough that if water kept rising, it would become a bottleneck. When we arrived, it was already ankle deep. The water was cold, and it moved slowly like it was being pulled by gravity. It smelled like a mix of concrete dust and something organic that I didn't want to name. Dean stared at it. It's deeper than it should be. Luis scanned the walls, looking for alternate routes. Any bypass? Dean looked at his map, then shook his head reluctantly. Not on paper. Malik pointed to a ladder up to an overhead hatch. That might connect to a higher corridor, but we don't know. Tarek said, "We also don't know what's on the other side of this water." Nadia's face was tight. "If we go through and it gets worse behind us, we can't come back." Luis crouched and touched the water with a gloved hand. He watched it swirl around his fingers. "It's not rushing, that's good. But it's rising, that's bad." He stood and looked at all of us. "We have to choose. We either push through now while we can still stand, or we gamble on a hatch we don't know." Dean's voice was hard. "We push through. We don't have time to play maze games." Nadia looked at Luis. "What do you think?" Luis didn't pretend certainty. He just waited. "If we climb a hatch and it's blocked, we waste time and battery. If we push through water and it rises, we lose this corridor anyway. But we need forward progress." He nodded. "We go through one by one, slow, feel for obstacles." We stepped into the water. The cold shot through my boots immediately. The water hit the floor, and you couldn't see debris. I moved carefully, sliding my foot rather than stepping, the way you move in a dark room to avoid slamming your shin into furniture. Halfway through, something brushed my ankle. I froze so hard my muscles cramped. It was probably debris, a loose cable, a piece of insulation. But my body didn't care about logic. My body cared about the fact that anything could be in the water with you. I forced myself to move, breath shallow. Nadia was behind me, shaking. Malik was ahead, steady, feeling the wall with his free hand. Dean was in front, impatient even in water. Tarek brought up the rear. We made it through. Then, as we climbed onto higher ground, we heard the sound that made my stomach drop. A sudden gurgle, like air escaping a pipe. Luis turned instantly, headlamp swinging to the right. Water was pouring from a wall joint in a side corridor, not a torrent, but a steady, increasing flow. It spilled into the low crossing we'd just used, making ripples spread fast. Dean swore, then caught himself and just growled, "Move!" Luis's voice snapped sharp. "Go, now, don't run, just go." We moved fast, boots slapping wet concrete, water dripping, adrenaline turning my hands numb. Behind us, the gurgle grew louder, and the water rose visibly in the dip as the new flow fed it. The tunnel had just changed the rules. It had decided our window was closing. We reached the utility vault access Dean wanted. A heavy door in the wall with a wheel handle and a sign that read, "Keep clear." Dean grabbed the wheel and spun. It resisted, then moved. The door opened with a groan that echoed like a siren. We froze, listening for any response from the sound. Nothing immediate. Dean pulled the door wider. Inside was a short corridor to a ladder leading up to a hatch. Above, faint daylight seeped through cracks. Daylight looked like a miracle and a threat at the same time. Luis whispered, "Listen first." We listened. Faint city noise. Wind. A distant crash. Nothing close. We climbed. Dean went first, then Malik, then me, then Nadia, then Luis, then Tarek. The ladder felt endless because the closer you get to daylight, the more your brain screams that you're about to walk into the thing you've been hiding from. Dean pushed the hatch carefully. It moved. He lifted it a few inches and peered out. He whispered down, "Alley. No one right here." We climbed out into the real world. It was late afternoon based on the slant of light. We were in an alley behind a row of buildings in West Philadelphia, not far from the dense hospital cluster, but far enough that the street felt less like a battlefield and more like a place that had been abandoned in a hurry. Cars were stopped at odd angles. A delivery truck sat with its rear doors open. Trash blew across the pavement like it couldn't find a place to land. There was a smell in the air, smoke somewhere, and the sour tang of garbage left in winter cold too long. The sky was normal. That was the most unsettling part. Blue-gray, clouds moving, like the planet hadn't received the memo. We moved quickly out of the alley, staying close to walls, scanning corners. Luis insisted we keep noise down. Dean wanted to sprint to the nearest building. Nadia looked like she might cry just from being under open sky again. We found a small fenced courtyard behind a low-rise building. An office or a clinic, where we could crouch behind a dumpster and look out onto the street without being seen immediately. That's when we saw them. Two figures shuffling down the sidewalk a block away, moving without urgency but steady. A third figure stumbled behind them. They were dressed like ordinary people, hoodies, jeans, a winter coat. But their movements were wrong, and their heads kept turning in small jerks like they were searching for something they couldn't quite name. Dean whispered, "Keep down." A car alarm started suddenly somewhere to the east, blaring. The infected figures turned toward the sound almost in unison and started moving faster, drawn like magnets. Luis leaned toward us. "Sound attracts them." Nadia's eyes were wide. "So, we can't just walk?" "No," Luis said. "We move smart, we use cover, we avoid open streets." Tarek scanned the area. "Where do we go?" Luis looked at Dean's map again, then at the street. "We need a place with resources and a chance to stay unseen. A small building, a house, something we can secure without making ourselves a beacon." Dean pointed. Row houses, side streets, less glass, less open space. Malik added, "And water." We moved through back alleys and narrow gaps between buildings, sticking to shadow. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't underground. Every sound seemed louder. Every footstep felt like an announcement. We avoided the main street. We crossed one road quickly when it was clear, using parked cars as cover. At one point we heard a distant scream and then a long, hungry chorus in response, and Nadia flinched so hard she nearly fell. Luis caught her shoulder. "Eyes on me. Breathe, one step at a time." We found an empty row house with a basement door slightly ajar. Dean insisted on checking it. Luis insisted on caution. They argued in whispers until Malik said, "We can't argue in the street." Dean eased the basement door open. The smell inside was stale, but not foul. No obvious signs of struggle. We slipped in and closed the door behind us. The basement was unfinished, with a concrete floor, shelves, and a water heater. It also had something precious: quiet. We stood in that basement and listened for a full minute, waiting for any sound of movement inside the house. Nothing. We went upstairs slowly, clearing rooms the way people do when they don't want to die, not the way movies do it with bravado. The house looked like someone left in a hurry. A chair knocked over, a blanket on a couch, a half-packed bag by the door. No bodies. No signs of infected. Just absence. We chose the back room on the first floor as a temporary safe spot because it had one window facing a fenced yard and could be covered with a curtain. Luis checked the kitchen. The fridge was dead, food warming, but there were canned goods in a pantry. Dean found a case of bottled water in a closet like the owners had stocked for a storm. We sat on the floor and ate quietly. Real food, not crushed bars. Canned beans never tasted so close to relief. And then Luis did something that surprised me. He made us talk about the tunnel. Not emotions, practical lessons. What killed tunnels for us? He asked. Dean snorted. Water. Water, yes, Luis said, and failing ventilation and unknown infected access. We use the tunnel to move, but we cannot assume it stays usable. It's a tool, not a home. Nadia looked down at her hands. I thought underground was safe. Luis's voice softened. It was safer than the lobby, that's all. Safer is relative now. Tarek, staring at the dark window, said, What happens when winter comes? When food runs out? When everything runs out? Nobody answered him because the answer was written into every empty house and every abandoned car. That night, we slept in a real room, on real furniture with blankets. But none of us slept deeply. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every distant bang sounded like a door giving way. In the early hours, I woke to Luis sitting at the window, peering through a crack in the curtain. His face was lit faintly by moonlight and the reflection of distant fires. What do you see? I whispered. He didn't look at me right away. Movement on the street, not close, but it's there. I sat up slowly. Do you think the city will stabilize? Luis finally looked at me, and his eyes held something like grief. I think the city will change. Stabilize is a word for before. I lay back down, but his words stayed in my head like a nail. The next few days became a pattern of careful living. We didn't stay in that row house long because staying anywhere long felt like tempting fate. We used the house as a recovery point. We drank, ate, cleaned ourselves as best we could. Nadia washed her scrubs in a sink and hung them to dry, then changed into clothes from the closet because scrubs were a beacon to memories she didn't want. We learned the neighborhood rhythm. Infected were drawn to noise, but they also wandered. Sometimes they passed by in small clusters. Sometimes they stood in the street like they were listening to something far away. Sometimes they moved suddenly, alerted by a sound we couldn't even hear, and we'd freeze behind a window and watch them shift like a tide. Dean became restless, pushing to move farther out. He believed the only safe place was away from the city entirely. Luis wanted a more measured approach. Gather supplies, gather information, then move. His calm wasn't denial, it was discipline. Nadia wanted to find other survivors, especially people trapped in buildings like Sharon's group. The idea of leaving them behind ate at her. Tarek wanted a weapon, any weapon, because he felt naked without one. He wasn't wrong about feeling vulnerable, but Luis kept him from doing anything reckless. Tools are for work, Luis said. If we turn everything into a weapon, we stop being people. Also, noise gets you killed. We compromised. We carried a few sturdy tools that were normal in a house. A hammer, a heavy flashlight, a crowbar. Not because we wanted fights, but because doors stick, debris blocks paths, and sometimes you need leverage to survive. On the third day, we heard something that changed our timeline, the generator sound. It wasn't in our row house. It was distant. A low hum that carried through cold air. Someone, somewhere had power. Power meant people. People meant resources and risk. Luis said we should investigate cautiously. Dean argued it was a trap. Nadia insisted that if someone had power, they might have news. We moved at dawn, staying off main streets. We skirted parks and used alley networks. We avoided the hospital district entirely. We crossed under an overpass where graffiti covered concrete like a mural of a world that used to be loud in a different way. The generator sound led us to a small commercial building, a corner grocery store with a roll-down metal gate halfway down. Behind it, in the rear lot, a portable generator sat inside a makeshift barrier of shopping carts and plywood. A cable ran through a broken window. Someone had set up a small fortress. We watched from behind a fence for nearly an hour, observing. A man came out once, checked the generator, refueled it from a red fuel can. 2 others appeared briefly in the window, peering out like animals in a burrow. They were alive, alert, organized. Luis decided to make contact because sometimes the risk of people is worth the reward of information. He approached slowly, hands visible, calling out, "Hello! We're survivors. We're not here to take anything." A voice shouted from inside, "Stop where you are." Luis stopped. He spoke calmly, explaining who we were, that we'd been underground, that we were looking for news and maybe a trade. The roll-down gate rattled slightly as someone inside shifted it to see out. A face appeared in the gap. A man in his 40s with tired eyes and a baseball cap. "What do you want?" the man demanded. "Information," Luis said, "and maybe a way to charge a phone. We have supplies to trade." The man laughed once, humorless. "Phones don't work." "Some do," Nadia said quietly, stepping forward enough to be seen. "Even if networks are down, they hold notes, maps, photos, anything. And if there's any signal anywhere, we need to know." The man's gaze flicked to her, softened slightly, then hardened again. "How many of you?" "6, Luis said. There was a long pause. Then the gate lifted a foot, and the man stepped out with 2 others behind him, both holding tools like weapons. "I'm Curtis," he said. "This is my store, or it was. Now it's a shelter. We've got 3 families in here. We don't let strangers in." Luis nodded, understood. Curtis studied us, especially Dean and Tarek, like he was measuring their anger. "You come from downtown?" "From the tunnels," Luis said carefully. Curtis's face tightened. "We sealed our basement access because we heard things down there." Luis's eyes narrowed. "Things." Curtis nodded, scratching, shuffling, like they were below trying to find a way up. Nadia's breath caught. Dean muttered, "Told you." Curtis continued, "We've got a battery radio. It works sometimes. Mostly static, but we caught one clear message yesterday." Luis leaned forward slightly. "What message?" Curtis looked at the sky like he wished it could answer for him. A recorded emergency broadcast. It said to shelter in place. It said to avoid contact. It said there are outbreaks in multiple cities. It said help is being organized. He didn't sound like he believed the last part. Luis asked, "Did it say anything about safe zones?" Curtis shook his head. "Just generic. Stay inside, don't travel, like anyone can do that forever." Nadia's eyes were wet. "Multiple cities." Curtis nodded. "This isn't just Philly." The information hit like cold water. Part of me had been clinging to a fantasy that this was local, that you could drive out and find normal somewhere. But multiple cities meant the map had changed. We traded canned food for a chance to use Curtis's generator outlet to charge phone and, more importantly, to charge a small rechargeable flashlight Curtis had. Luis also copied Curtis's notes about the radio broadcast into our notepad, because memory is fragile when fear is constant. Curtis offered one more piece of advice before we left. If you go underground again, don't trust it. Water's coming up, sewers are backing, pumps are failing. The city's gonna flood from below in places. Luis nodded. We saw it. Curtis looked at Nadia. If you're medical, people need you. Nadia's voice broke slightly. People needed me before this, too. We left Curtis's store with charged phones, more clarity, and a deeper dread. That night, back in another temporary house, we argued about direction. Dean wanted out of the city immediately. He believed the only way to survive was rural. Fewer infected, more space, more time. Luis pointed out that rural also means fewer supplies, fewer shelters, fewer chances to find organized help, and more exposure on open roads. Nadia wanted to go back for Sharon's group, or at least try. Tarek wanted to stick with any group that had power and barricades, even if it meant being trapped. Malik listened, then said the simplest truth. We can't save everyone, but we can choose not to abandon people when we have a chance. His words landed heavily. Luis rubbed his face. He looked exhausted in a way that wasn't just sleep deprivation. It was leadership fatigue, the burden of being the one who had to make a call. We do one more tunnel run, he said finally. We use it to reach Sharon's building from a different access if we can. We bring water and food. We give them a chance to relocate or at least prepare. Then we move west, out of the densest zones. Dean started to object. Luis cut him off, voice firm but not angry. We are alive because people helped us. Nadia found us. Sharon helped us. Curtis gave us information. If we cut every rope behind us, we become the kind of survivor that dies alone. Dean's jaw clenched. Then he nodded once, tight. Fine, one run. Nadia looked like she might collapse with relief. So we prepared. We packed water, food, extra batteries, and tools for opening stuck doors. Luis insisted on bringing a rope from the house garage and a roll of bright tape for marking routes, because getting lost underground was not an option. He also insisted we bring something to block doors quietly if needed, like wedges cut from scrap wood, because a door that closes behind you is not always your friend. We entered the tunnels again through a basement access Curtis had marked on a map. One he said was sealed from his side but still accessible from a nearby building's maintenance room. It took time to find it. It took careful movement to avoid infected on streets. But we got there. We slipped into the building through a broken service door and descended into the utility corridor like divers entering dark water. Immediately, we felt the difference. The tunnel was colder than before in that area, and the air was heavier. Water was present in a constant, shallow sheet in some sections. The drip rhythm had become a trickle in places, like leaks were worsening. Luis marked our entry point with tape. So we can find it again, he said, so we don't die in a maze. We moved fast but careful, following the route toward Sharon's building, using Dean's map and Luis's memory. We avoided low points when possible, but sometimes the tunnel forced us through ankle-deep water again, and each time my nerves screamed about what could be hidden below the surface. Halfway there, we encountered a collapsed section. Not a cave-in, not dramatic rubble, but a heavy metal security gate that had dropped down across a corridor, sealing it. It was the kind of gate meant to compartmentalize areas during maintenance or emergencies. It was down, and it was locked. Dean grabbed the bars and shook. The gate didn't move. Luis stared at it, jaw tight. This wasn't down before. Malik pointed to a wall panel nearby with indicator lights. Emergency system, it triggered. Tarek's voice rose before he could stop it. So, the tunnel is closing itself. Luis nodded slowly. Yes. Nadia's face went pale. What do we do? Luis stepped back, forced himself to breathe, and looked at the map again. We find another route. We backtracked, moving faster now, because backtracking wastes time and battery, and time underground is measured in system failures. Water rose while you walked. Air got worse while you argued. We found an alternate corridor that led toward Sharon's building through a different branch. It was narrower, lower ceiling, with more conduit and fewer steam lines. It smelled mustier, like it hadn't been used in a while. That scared me more than the heat had. Unused tunnels collect problems. We moved anyway. Then, in the distance, we heard that unmistakable sound again, splashing. Luis froze. He killed his headlamp. We followed, darkness swallowing us. The splashing was closer than last time. And then we heard it. That broken, half-formed vocal sound, like someone trying to speak through a throat that didn't remember words. Nadia's hand found mine again, grip tight. Dean held his pipe so hard his knuckles went white. Tarek's breathing was loud until Luis gestured sharply and he forced it quieter. The sound came around the bend. In the dim glow of a distant emergency indicator light, we saw shapes, more than 3 this time. They moved slowly through water, dragging feet, bumping into walls. One of them trailed a hand along the concrete like it was reading the tunnel by touch. They were close enough that I could hear their breathing, wet and ragged. I held my breath until my lungs burned. One of them stopped. Its head turned slightly, like it sensed something. My heart hammered. A single mistake, one cough, one scrape of boot, would bring them in. Luis, in the dark, did something I will never forget. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal nut, hardware from his work pouch. He tossed it gently, not hard, down the corridor behind us. It clinked faintly, a tiny sound. The infected head snapped toward it. Then another head turned. The group shifted, drawn by that small noise like it mattered more than anything. They started shuffling in the other direction, following the clink's echo. Luis waited until the splashing faded, then motioned us back the way we came, slow and silent. We retreated, hearts pounding, and found another branch corridor, choosing it not because we were sure, but because staying still was death. After another long, tense stretch, we reached a familiar maintenance door. Luis checked the label and exhaled. This is it. This should lead into Sharon's building's lower service level. He listened. Silence. He tried the handle. Locked. Dean muttered, "Of course." Luis pulled out the wedge and tried sliding it, but the door seal was tight. Then Nadia stepped forward and whispered, "Sharon, if you're there, it's Nadia." We waited. Nothing. Nadia whispered again, louder. "Sharon, it's Nadia from the office suite. We came back." A long moment passed, then, faintly, through the door we heard movement. A small scrape, a cautious breath. Then Sharon's voice, shaking. "Nadia?" Nadia sagged, like her spine had been holding her up by will alone. "Yes? We're here. We have food and water. We need to talk." The lock clicked, the door opened a crack, and Sharon's terrified eyes appeared. When she saw us, dirty, soaked at the boots, alive, her face crumpled with relief and fear. She let us in quickly and shut the door behind us like she was sealing a lifeboat hatch. Inside, the office suite looked worse. Supplies were lower. People's faces were more hollow. Ken looked older by a decade. Priya clutched her phone like it was a prayer. Tarek's former co-worker, another security guard, sat in a corner staring at nothing. The impacts on the building doors had continued, Sharon said. They'd barricaded better, moved deeper into the building, tried to keep lights low. The generator was still running, but fuel was down. Water pressure was weaker. Luis explained what we'd learned. Multiple cities, failing tunnels, rising water, blocked gates. Sharon whispered, "So there's no rescue?" Luis didn't lie. "I don't know, but I know waiting here until fuel ends is a gamble." Nadia told them about Curtis's store and the idea of moving west, away from the densest zones, using alleys and careful travel, possibly using tunnels only as short connectors, not as homes. Ken looked torn. "If we leave, we're exposed. And if you stay," Louise said, "you're trapped." That word, trapped, hung in the room like smoke. They debated, voices low, and I watched the human mind wrestle with change. People cling to familiar walls even when the walls are becoming coffins. People fear motion because motion's risk. But staying is risk too, just slower. In the end, Sharon made a decision that felt like swallowing glass. She would bring her group out, those who could walk, while there was still a chance. Ken agreed. Priya shook so hard she could barely speak, but she nodded. 2 others chose to stay, too terrified to move, choosing the illusion of safety over the gamble of escape. Nobody judged them out loud. We all knew we might become them someday. We planned the exit carefully. We would not go back through the tunnel route we used. Too risky, too many infected sightings, and the gate system might trap us. Instead, we would use a different basement exit Sharon knew, one that led to a back courtyard and then into side streets. We would move in small clusters, no shouting, no sudden noise. We would carry only what mattered. We left that building the next morning. 8 people now, moving like shadows through a city that looked normal until you noticed how empty it was. The tunnels had saved us, and the tunnels had tried to kill us. They were a passage, not a refuge. As we moved west, away from the hospital district, I kept thinking about the service corridor beneath my feet. Pipes and cables, humming and hissing, built to carry life for people who never thought about it. A hidden artery of the city. And I realized something simple. The world above depended on the world below, and when the systems below failed, the city didn't just lose lights and water. It lost time. Because time is what infrastructure buys you. It buys you calm. It buys you options. It buys you the ability to pretend tomorrow is guaranteed. In the service tunnel that was never meant for people, I learned that survival wasn't about being tough. It was about being quiet, being patient, being practical, and knowing when a place that kept you alive yesterday will kill you tomorrow. We didn't know where we were going. We didn't have a promised safe zone. We didn't have a radio voice telling us exactly what to do. We had water bottles, bruised feet, and a map drawn by someone who used to fix things for a living. We had each other. And for that day, in that broken Philadelphia morning, that was enough to keep moving. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.